September 1, 1943, Rabaul Aerodrome, New Britain. Commander Saburo Sakai, a Japanese ace with more than 20 confirmed victories, skimmed over a report recently brought in by Naval Intelligence. Its reading provoked muffled laughter among the officers. The Americans had launched a new fighter. It was called Hellcat, heavy as a bomber, tall as a cargo carrier, and with the appearance of an agricultural instrument. A fighter that flew with armor? That he needed radios to coordinate maneuvers? To the Imperial aviators, that was everything a fighter plane should not be. But that laugh carried more than disdain. He also carried ignorance about the war that was to come. That's the story of the F6F Hellcat, an aircraft built with industrial logic, guided by radar, protected by steel, and armed to survive, not just fight. And that, in 6 months, he would rewrite all the rules of air combat in the Pacific. This video reveals how a fighter ridiculed by the Japanese became responsible for the systematic annihilation of the Empire's naval aviation. The pilots laughed. Statistics answered. The Hellcat didn't beat the Zeros. He erased them from the sky. But before we dive into the names, the fights, and the dates, there's one statistic that defines this whole story. The F6F Hellcat ended the war with a rate of 19 kills for every combat loss. No other fighter of World War II achieved anything similar. There were more than 5,200 enemy aircraft destroyed, most of them Zeros, while only 270 Hellcats did not return. Behind these numbers was an uncomfortable truth. It wasn't just one plane that fought. It was an entire industry, synchronized, mass-producing machines with the same precision with which it produced destiny. What started as a joke in the Japanese bases would turn into a statistical nightmare. And to understand how laughter turned into silence, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, when the Empire still believed that courage could overcome steel. If you value the story told with data, respect, and depth, leave your like and subscribe. This helps keep alive the memory of those who believed they were flying above the impossible. Between 1940 and 1942, there was one name that caused silent panic in any Allied pilot in the Pacific: A6M Zero. On the wings of this aircraft flew the conviction of the Japanese Empire that the war would be won by the superiority of spirit and refined technique. It was light, elegant, and fast. Its turning radius was the smallest among all fighters in operation. Its range exceeded 1,000 nautical miles, a feat that until then seemed impossible for a single engine. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no reliable radios. Everything that did not serve lightness was discarded. And, paradoxically, that's what made him invincible for a while. Zero shot down everything it could find: British Buffaloes, American P-40s, Australian Hurricanes. At Pearl Harbor, 29 Zeros were shot down, while 347 Allied aircraft burned to the ground. In the Philippines, 7 Japanese fighters fell in direct combat against more than 100 of the Americans. About Darwin, there were only 2 Zeros lost, and 30 Australian aircraft destroyed. The supremacy was so absolute that it began to seem mystical. Japanese pilots trained for years were considered holy warriors, and Zero, his invisible sword. The West was perplexed. When the first Zeros fell into Allied territory and were analyzed by American engineers, the incredulity was technical. How could something so light be so lethal? The comparison with American planes was humiliating. The P-39 Airacobra weighed almost twice as much. The F-4F Wildcat, its predecessor, was slow, thick, and unyielding. To the Japanese, American fighters flew like trucks, and this metaphor, repeated frequently in Japanese reports, was not an insult. It was an observation. They were partly right. The United States was still stuck with a defensive fighter doctrine, geared toward bomber protection, not air supremacy. Their fighters, reinforced, designed to absorb damage, lost in aerial duels. And in the Pacific, the war was between duelists. Japan flew like an army of swordsmen, but there was something invisible on the horizon, and that the Japanese didn't see: scale. In 1942, Japan produced about 3,000 Zero fighters. By the same year, the United States was already building more than 24,000 combat aircraft of various models. In absolute numbers, the balance was turning, but no one seemed to notice. Japanese doctrine remained stuck in the idea that the warrior surpassed the system. Meanwhile, the United States invested billions in factories, standardization, and production in uninterrupted shifts. In June 1942, at the Battle of Midway, the Japanese lost 4 carriers in just 2 days. It was the first crack, but even there, Zero still reigned in the skies. It was believed that with good pilots and efficient tactics, it would be possible to reverse any material disadvantage. It was a faith, and it was a fallacy. What the Japanese didn't know is that on the other side of the Pacific, the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation was developing, in record time, a new fighter. It would not have the lightness of the Zero, nor its maneuverability, but it would have something that the Japanese despised: armor, stability, raw power, a steel monster with wings, a fighter that Japanese engineers would laugh at when they see, and pilots, even more so. But that laugh would be brief, because the following year, the Bethpage plant in New York alone would produce more Hellcats than all the Zeros made in Japan in 3 years of war. Pause. This is the time when many Japanese still believed that the war would be won in the cockpit. But while Japan was manufacturing 5,000 fighters a year, the United States was already producing 35,000 in series, with standardized maintenance and interchangeable parts, a statistic ignored by Axis strategists. If this number surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. This story is just beginning, because the Hellcat hadn't even made it to the battlefield yet. But when he arrived, he didn't just stand up to Zero, he dismantled the entire philosophy that underpinned it. And in the next part, we'll get into the mind of Japanese doctrine, where honor outweighed armor, and where absolute trust in pilots would be its silent downfall. To understand the magnitude of the approaching defeat, one must first understand the unwavering faith the Japanese placed in their pilots, and the doctrine that shaped them. The naval aviation of the Japanese Empire was not just a military force. It was a symbolic extension of the national soul, forged under the principles of Bushido, the path of the warrior. A pilot's training was not only technical, but spiritual. The training required not only skill with the aircraft, but an absolute devotion to honorable death in combat. Joining the Naval Air Service was a privilege reserved for a few. Candidates went through brutal screenings, and those who survived the academy flew with an almost mystical pride. Each pilot was a samurai from the skies, and each Zero, an invisible sword with wings. There was no room for error, nor for hesitation. The goal was total aerial dominance based on courage, maneuverability, and individual instinct. Japan saw war as a dueling ground, where man would win by personal moral and technical superiority. In this logic, Western technology was viewed with suspicion. Radios? An unnecessary burden. Coordination in combat should come from intuition, not communication. Shield? A burden that would only slow down maneuverability. The Zero didn't need to protect the pilot. The pilot needed to be worthy of the aircraft. Self-sealing tanks? A cowardly resource, useful only for those who were afraid of falling. Japanese doctrine extolled rapid attack, precise movement, and glorious death. Airplanes were designed for this. Light, agile, without any excess. The aesthetics of deadly simplicity. And it worked. For 2 years, the skies of the Pacific were Japanese domain. But this absolute confidence hit a dangerous blind spot: the refusal to accept change. The Japanese high command viewed the war as a ritual. The Americans, like an equation. The empire trained artists from the air, the United States, machine operators. The Japanese pilot was trained for 3 years, flew hundreds of hours before the first combat, learned philosophy of war and complex aerobatics. But there was a limit. I couldn't make mistakes. The American pilot, on the other hand, often with fewer hours, flew with radios, updated maps, radar support, and aircraft designed to resist error. The Zeros, when they emerged, seemed unbeatable, but not because they flew higher or shot harder. They won because they operated in a scenario that favored individual agility. The moment the Americans changed the rules and turned air combat into a game of energy, coordination, and altitude, Japanese doctrine began to crumble. The problem was not with the drivers. It was in the world they believed existed, in which bravery was enough, and where machines were just tools, not systems. With each new defeat, the doctrine closed in on itself. It refused improvements, ignored reports, rejected adaptations. Armor, radios, energy tactics, coordinated formations. Everything was treated as Western weakness. The belief was simple: if we need all this to win, we have already lost. But war does not listen to philosophies. It responds to efficiency. And by 1943, efficiency was about to reach the skies of the Pacific in the form of a sea blue monster, a heavy, robust, ugly fighter, and, according to Japanese pilots, unable to win in a dogfight. It was everything that the Empire despised, and paradoxically everything he couldn't defeat. Because while Japan was manufacturing philosophy with wings, the United States was about to manufacture a serial weapon, with the same precision with which it manufactured automobiles. And the day this plane entered combat, the samurai duel would give way to the mathematics of destruction. Grumman already had a name for it: F6F Hellcat. Japan still had a code to protect itself: pride. In the next part, Japanese intelligence reports will report with irony the appearance of a fighter so heavy that it looked like a flying joke, and the laughter that echoed in the tents of Rabaul was about to find its answer, in silence and fire. In January 1943, the first reports about the new American fighter began to circulate among intelligence officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The material came mainly from neutral sources in Sweden and from indirect observations in the Central Pacific Theater. The specifications for the Japanese High Command bordered on the absurd: maximum takeoff weight of more than 12,000 pounds, almost double that of the agile A6M Zero, 2,000 horsepower radial engine, 650 caliber machine guns, more than 2,400 rounds of ammunition, armor around the cabin, self-sealing fuel tanks, bulletproof canopy, reinforced cockpit. To the Japanese engineers, this was an insult to the concept of air combat. An airplane that needed armor to fly? An armored fighter was, by definition, an easier target. For the Japanese pilots, trained to turn around the enemy, there was no doubt. The so-called Hellcat would be just another victim of the Zero's superior maneuverability. Minoru Genda, architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor and one of Japan's most respected tactical thinkers, reviewed the Hellcat's specifications in March 1943. His assessment, recorded in the combined fleet files, was straightforward. The Americans still don't understand the value of the pilot. They try to compensate for inferiority of skill with excess weight and weapons. Saburo Sakai, legendary ace with more than 20 wins, was even more sarcastic. If they want to put truck wheels and use that as a tractor, maybe it works better. An airplane that needs a steel plate to protect the pilot does not deserve to be in the sky. The conclusion was unanimous. The Hellcat was slow, heavy, and poorly designed. Japan, used to winning with precision and lightness, saw no threat, just volume. But it was not the first time that the Empire had laughed before it understood. The same pattern had been repeated with American armored ships, which they considered slow fortresses, until they saw their endurance in protracted battles. Now this contempt turned to the air. The error was doctrinal. Japan did not realize that the Hellcat had not been designed to compete in a duel. It had been created to win the concept of the duel. Its armor wasn't an excess. It was a shield against the Japanese combat style. Their self-sealing tanks weren't weight. They were survival. Its weaponry was not a redundancy. It was a guarantee of slaughter. The Hellcat didn't need to spin any faster. It just needed to survive the first attack, maintain energy, and return with power and altitude. He would no longer be a player in Pacific aerial chess. It would be the new rule of the board. Behind the scenes, Grumman's engineers worked at a war pace. The design of the F6F was born out of a direct request from the U.S. Navy. A fighter that could operate from aircraft carriers, have long range, great firepower, easy maintenance, and high production at scale. Every line of the project reflected this. The engineers knew they weren't drawing a knight. They were designing a combat tractor. Tough, reliable, lethal. It was the concept of war maintenance. An aircraft that could be damaged, repaired, relocated, and launched again in a matter of hours. It was not aerodynamic perfection that guided the pencils of the designers. It was the logic of mass production and operational longevity. The F6F could operate with damage. He could lose part of his wing. It could be hit by dozens of projectiles, and yet fly. Not coincidentally, many American pilots who landed their Hellcats with holes in their canopy and blood on their shoulders were seen again in the air the next day. While Japan formed aces, the United States formed survivors. And there was something that Japanese reports could not measure. The Hellcat was quietly part of a network, a system that included radios, radars, interception controllers, ground logistical support, standardized parts, continuous replenishment, and formation flight doctrine. The Japanese saw only the plane, and that's why they underestimated what was behind it. The irony increased. When the first Hellcats began to appear on Japanese radars in late September 1943, many commanders believed they were facing single-engine bombers. The size of the fuselage and the presence of armor confused eyes accustomed to the sharp elegance of the Zeros. Initial reports described the F6Fs as experimental direct attack fighters, indicating that Japanese pilots did not yet understand the tactical change that was underway. The surprise wasn't just in the shape of the Hellcat, but in the way it fought. He didn't go into curves. He didn't try to spin. He went up. It would go up with a 2,000 horsepower engine and then dive at twice the speed of a Zero. A Japanese pilot was waiting for a dogfight. It received a vertical discharge. There was no dancing, just collision. On the first recorded intercept mission, a Japanese pilot survived the encounter with a Hellcat, but returned with his plane riddled with bullets. It was like being shot through a wall, he wrote. He didn't turn. He fell on top of me. And that was just the beginning. Because in a few days, the numbers would cease to be theory, and laughter at intelligence briefings would be replaced by silence and absences in hangars. In the next part, the first direct confrontation between Zero and Hellcat, the moment when Japanese doctrine collided with American physics, and gravity changed sides. The F6F Hellcat was not born as a response to a specific aircraft, but as a solution to a systemic problem. Winning an air war where individual skill was no longer enough. In 1942, the U.S. Navy made a clear demand of Grumman. It needed a naval fighter that could be mass-produced, withstand damage, master vertical combat, and operate in any condition, even in the hands of pilots with little actual combat experience. The logic was straightforward. The fighter would not be a masterpiece of performance but a reliable instrument of repeated destruction. And Grumman responded with a first-of-its-kind approach. The project was completed in record time, based on what the F4F Wildcat had taught, and what the Zero had proven to be vulnerable. The center of the new fighter would be the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder power plant that delivered more than 2,000 horsepower. That engine, when combined with a 3-bladed Hamilton standard propeller and a new wing profile, gave the Hellcat a climb rate of 3,500 feet per minute. In combat, that meant vertical superiority and mastery of energy. To keep the structure stable, the fuselage was designed with internal reinforcements, allowing the plane to withstand forces of up to 13 Gs in evasive maneuvers or attack dives. This would later explain how so many Hellcats returned with visible, but still manageable, structural damage. Shielding was another calculated decision. The cockpit was surrounded by 212 pounds of steel plate, protecting the pilot from front and side fire. The oil system received an additional 110 pounds of protection. The self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb multiple impacts without exploding. The Zero, by comparison, used lightweight duralumin alloys and structures without any protection, which made it a flying wonder, but a death trap at first shot. The choice of weaponry also followed the doctrine of destructive redundancy. 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with a capacity of 2,400 rounds. Each gun fired 750 rounds per minute. The result was a fiery cloud of 4,500 shells per minute, a wall of destruction. The intention was not surgical precision, but saturation. American pilots wouldn't need to be aces. They would need to keep the reticle over the target for 3 seconds, and that would be enough. At the Grumman plant on Long Island, the mentality was different. While Japan manufactured each Zero almost as a craft, the United States turned the Hellcat into a serialized product. Every screw, every piece, every panel was standardized. This allowed not only scale production, but immediate maintenance. A damaged Hellcat could be disassembled and reassembled with new parts in a matter of hours. And, more importantly, any pilot could sit in the cockpit and find the exact same controls, regardless of the batch. The average assembly time for an F6F has dropped to less than 90 minutes per cell. At its peak, Grumman was producing as many as 600 Hellcats a month, one plane every 60 minutes. It was the industrialization of air combat. America didn't want to win with a genius driver. I wanted to make sure that even an average driver had an advantage. This was the logic of the system, not to depend on the exception, but to ensure the efficiency of the rule. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Japan saw the airplane as an extension of the warrior, America as an extension of the factory. One of them projected with honor, the other, with calculation. And if you're enjoying unraveling these technical contrasts in depth, show your support. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to reveal how the war was won behind the scenes of engineering. But what did all this mean in practice? How would this series-built machine react when it encountered the legendary Zero on its own turf? In the next part, the first clash, a confident Japanese driver, a Hellcat that didn't seem able to spin, and a vertical climb that would defy the logic of air combat. September 30th, 1943. Open skies over Marcus Island, one of the most isolated and strategic points in the Central Pacific. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui, an experienced Japanese naval aviation pilot, took off with his patrol of Zeros and escort on a reconnaissance mission. The interception, it seemed, would be routine. Within minutes of reaching cruising altitude, 6 silhouettes appeared on the horizon, rising in tight formation. At first, Fukui mistook them for B-25 bombers. The fuselage was too wide, the wings disproportionately short. But when they leaned over and took up a fighting position, Fukui understood. They were fighters, and not just any hunting. They were F6F Hellcats. It was the first direct encounter between the new American fighter and Japan's air pride. Fukui reacted as he had been trained. He dived into a sharp turn, hoping that the heavier Americans would follow a straight line and allow the rear approach maneuver, the tactical signature of the Zero. But what happened next defied learned logic. The Hellcat ahead did not turn. He went up, vertical, straight. Within seconds, Fukui saw his speed drop, his angle lock, and his aircraft lose lift. The Zero, with its 1,130 HP Nakajima engine, just couldn't keep up. At 15,000 feet, the F6F performed a hammer maneuver. It climbed to the stall point, rotated around its own axis, and dove directly over the Zero's tail. The attack speed was overwhelming. The sight was acquired at 400 meters. And then came the sound. 6 Browning machine guns firing simultaneously, spitting out 4,500 rounds per minute. In 3 seconds, Fukui's aircraft was hit 17 times. The panel burst. The landing gear burst into flames. The stabilizer broke. He survived by reflex. He kept Zero flying downhill, praying to reach the island. He managed to land, but his wingman, Petty Officer Masao, disappeared, and the reconnaissance plane they escorted never returned. In the demobilization tent, Fukui's report generated discomfort. Japanese doctrine predicted that a Zero would always win on the curve. Always. The idea that a heavier fighter could not only escape, but dominate vertically, was unheard of. The first crack in pride had appeared. The command was still hesitant to accept. It was an isolated case, they said, a stroke of luck. But the next day, 2 new encounters resulted in more losses. And over the next 30 days, Japanese doctrine would be put to the test in an ongoing and painfully way. What pilots like Fukui began to realize was that the Hellcat did not respond to tactical provocations. He didn't get involved in dogfighting. He didn't descend to Zero's level. He operated on a different plane, higher, faster, more protected. Combat was now asymmetrical. The Zero offered maneuverability. The Hellcat offered power. And in the air, energy was life. The difference in power between the engines, until then underestimated, showed its value. While the Zero's Nakajima lost efficiency above 18,000 feet, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 still delivered 1,600 horsepower at 25,000. This allowed the Hellcat to control the altitude of the battle, climbing when necessary, diving with lethal speed, and returning to the upper position before the enemy reacted. It was a new doctrine: energy combat. Short, devastating, coordinated attacks always from above. To the Japanese, accustomed to circular maneuvers and angle disputes, it was alien and lethal. The armor, previously a laughingstock, showed its effectiveness. Even when hit, the Hellcat held up. The Japanese pilots reported frustration, direct hits with no visible effect. The Zero, on the other hand, upon receiving a single 50 hit on the tank, would catch fire. On average, a Zero needed 3 to 4 hits to fall. One Hellcat, more than 20. The disproportion was not just tactical, it was structural. And with each new mission, the Japanese pilots returned with less confidence. The maneuvers that had won wars for 2 years now ended in losses. The aircraft that should not be able to fly in curves was winning without even entering them. And worse, it was being produced on a large scale. While the Zeros were assembled with specific parts, adjusted by hand, the Hellcat rolled off the assembly line with interchangeable parts, simplified maintenance and modular design. The pilots knew they were facing something bigger than a fighter. They were facing a system. The irony did not escape the most attentive. What Japan saw as excess, weight, armor, communication, was exactly what ensured the survival of the Hellcat. The philosophy of war that exalted sacrifice now faced a machine made to avoid losses, and industrial logic began to swallow the myth of honor. But that was still just the beginning, because what the Japanese called the exception, the first meeting, was about to become routine, and in the next part, Japanese combat doctrine will finally be broken, not by numbers, but by tactics that simply could not be answered. October 5, 1943, Wake Island, U.S. Navy. Task Force 14 begins an air attack on Japanese installations. On the surface, it looked like one more among many U.S. raids of harassment. Quick, calculated, and usually withdrawing before Japanese fighters could respond in full force. But that morning, something changed. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, leading 12 Zero fighters from the 252nd Air Group, took off with high morale. Previous reports indicated a lineup of just 12 U.S. fighters, ideal targets for a surprise attack from higher altitude. They had numerical, tactical, and positional advantage. Nothing indicated that this would be the last time that the Japanese doctrine would work, or even make sense. Flying at 20,000 feet, the Zeros dived at high speed, ready to execute the classic maneuver, initial attack from above, followed by combat maneuvered to the annihilation of the enemy. That was how they had won dozens of battles. But when he spotted the Hellcats, something seemed strange. The Americans did not disperse. They did not move away. They did not attempt to turn in defensive combat. They maintained the formation, 3 V divisions, flying as if they were a single coordinated unit. When the Zeros opened fire at the edge of the range, hoping to cause damage and generate disorganization, the Hellcats' response was muted. They absorbed the shots. The armor plates protecting the pilot, oil systems and self-sealing tanks did their job. No Hellcat was shot down in the first few minutes. And then, the answer came. The Hellcats sped up for a smooth dive, without losing energy, maintaining the cohesion of the group. They did not respond with evasive maneuvers. They responded with strategy. Maneuvered combat, the basis of Japanese doctrine, was ignored. Instead, the Americans climbed again, gaining altitude, while the Zeros had already expended their energy in aggressive dives. At 25,000 feet, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 still delivered 1,600 horsepower. The Japanese Nakajima dropped to 900. The sky turned into a sloping field, with the Hellcats above, and the Zeros trapped in lower levels, with little ability to return. It was at this moment that the concept of energy combat revealed itself in its full form. The Hellcats dived at high speed, fired their 650 machine guns with devastating accuracy, and climbed up again, leaving the Zeros with no chance of counterattack. This was not a dogfight. It was a systematic execution. Americans operated like cogs in a machine. While one pilot was briefly engaged, the partner was already in a superior position, ready to attack from above. Radio communication, once derided by the Japanese as an unnecessary burden, now proved decisive. Each American division covered its sector, warned of enemy movements, coordinated attacks in pairs. It was an aerial network, and it was working perfectly. 8 Zeros were shot down. No Hellcat was lost. But the most important thing was not the number. It was the change in perception. Lieutenant Shiga would record in his diary the most bitter confession of his career. They no longer fight our war. They don't behave like aviators. They don't duel. They attack like machines. Their speed is not just engine speed. It's thinking. That phrase symbolized what many other veterans had come to feel. The battlefield had been transformed. What had once been an arena of honor, courage, and skill had become an environment of mathematical precision, tactical logic, and material supremacy. Radium, which Japanese pilots avoided to keep their weight down, became the symbol of the doctrinal abyss. While the Empire's squadrons operated visually, not knowing where the enemy was until they saw it, the Americans fought as if they had eyes in all directions. It was more than a superior fighter. It was a superior system. The Hellcat didn't have to be the best airplane in the corner. It just needed to avoid the curve. And that, for the Japanese, was unthinkable. Refusing direct combat was a denial of Bushido. But for Americans, it was efficiency. It was doctrine. It was a logic of survival. This cultural difference manifested itself in every tactical decision. While the Zeros launched into solitary and heroic attacks, the Hellcats operated in pairs and divisions as a unified force. The Japanese flew as individual warriors, the Americans as a system. The Western industrial warfare mentality, with its emphasis on repetition, predictability, and asset preservation, was beginning to crush the lethal romanticism of Japanese air warfare. And if there were still doubts about the fate of this difference in approach, the next few months would bring the most devastating evidence. Because by the time the Japanese began to understand how the Americans were struggling, the time for adaptation had already run out. The speed of production, the depth of training, and the American logistical stability had created an invisible wall in the skies of the Pacific, a wall that not even the bravest of pilots could cross. In the next part, that wall will become visible when Japan discovers that the enemy is now guided by something they didn't even know existed: radar. At the end of 1943, something strange began to happen in the skies of the Pacific. Experienced Japanese pilots such as Sadamu Kumachi reported engagements in which the Hellcat simply appeared out of nowhere. There was no warning. There was no prior eye contact. No sound coming from the horizon. Only the impact, shots coming from above in a precise, coordinated, lethal descent. Kumachi miraculously survived one of these encounters. It was shot down over the Marshall Islands and rescued by local fishermen. He later wrote, "There was no time for maneuver. It was as if they knew exactly where we would be. They didn't look for us. They were already waiting for us." For the first time in the war, Japan was not only being outclassed technologically, he was being hunted by a force that saw through the clouds, the night, and even the silence. Radar had entered the scene, and not just as a defense tool, but as a weapon of attack. The United States Navy implemented, starting in 1943, a vector control system that completely revolutionized air combat. Units embarked with CXAM-1 and SK radars, operating from aircraft carriers such as the USS Enterprise and USS Essex, detected enemy formations more than 100 miles away. This data was transmitted in real time to the Hellcat fighters via coded radio. American pilots did not look for the enemy in the air. They were guided directly to him. This completely nullified the Japanese tactical advantage based on visual surprise. Worse, while the Zeros still flew as if the war were a continuation of samurai dueling, the Hellcats now operated as sensor-guided predators. Japanese reaction time plummeted. The first visual contact an Empire pilot had with the enemy was often the moment when his aircraft was already being fired upon. To Japan's strategists, this seemed like magic, but it was pure engineering and networking. And the most impressive, the Hellcat, despite not having onboard radar in the first models, was part of an aerial interception system controlled by operators on land and at sea. This doctrine, called GCI, ground-controlled interception, allowed relatively inexperienced pilots to have a tactical advantage over veteran Japanese aces. Each battle began to be initiated with an invisible asymmetry, and with each engagement, the Americans lost fewer aircraft. On the other hand, the Japanese could not understand what was happening. Their combat reports began to sound repetitive. We were attacked by enemies that appeared out of nowhere. American formations were positioned even before our takeoff. We couldn't escape even with an altitude advantage. War, which was once visual, was now electronic, and Japan was blind. And here's a fact that the Germans, and the Japanese Gummerlar, completely ignored. While the Axis invested in isolated wonder aircraft projects, the United States produced, in 1943 alone, more than 8,500 operational radars for integration into air, naval, and land forces. The number exceeds by more than 10 times the combined production of radars in Germany and Japan during the war. If you were surprised by this, leave it in the comments. Absolute power or logistics wins, because this war was also decided by those who knew how to see where others could not see. But American technological superiority did not stop at the radar. Along with it came tactical radios, coded frequencies, multi-squadron interception tactics. Now, an attack wasn't just a mission, it was a coordinated orchestra. A group of Hellcats would climb to a certain altitude to attract the Zeros. Another group, silent, was positioned at a higher height, ready to dive down. Radar and communication made it possible to think in 3 dimensions. The Americans didn't just win the fight, they controlled where and when it would begin. The Japanese, on the other hand, still relied on vision and luck. With each mission, Japanese doctrine became more obsolete. The philosophy of individual combat, based on honor and intuition, was being swallowed up by an industrial combat architecture. The Hellcats are no longer just planes. They became nodes of a larger network, a network that included ships, stations, operators, and radio-synchronized tactics. War ceased to be a duel and became a system. And systems do not feel fear. They do not hesitate. They just execute. The following month, during the campaigns in the Gilbert Islands, this new paradigm would reach its apex, and Japan would see, for the first time, the sky dominated not by pilots, but by a serial production of logic, steel, and silence. Because now the enemy didn't need to be seen. He already knew where you would be, and I was waiting. At the beginning of 1944, the Japanese Empire still boasted a discourse of resistance and honor, but in the hangars, training centers, and cockpits, the reality had already turned into something close to silent hopelessness. Japanese naval aviation, which at the height of 1941 trained pilots with more than 700 hours of flight time, could now barely offer 70. The traditional training, marked by years of discipline, martial arts, and combat doctrines, had been replaced by emergency courses of only 3 months. Young people of 17 or 18 years old, some still without beards on their faces, were assigned to fly missions with rationed fuel, training ammunition, and orders that sounded more like farewells than tactics. Human collapse was underway, not out of weakness, but out of arithmetic. In less than 2 years, Japan had lost more than 1/200 of its best pilots, and the doctrine that despised replacement because it trusted in the genius of the warrior now faced its limit. The system had not been designed for mass training. It was a philosophy aimed at training air artists, not war operators, but the war demanded the opposite. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the American machine functioned as an assembly line of brains and bodies. Each Hellcat pilot completed at least 300 hours of flight time prior to assignment to combat. It went through tactical training courses, simulators, reading intelligence reports, and intensive practice in pair combat. They flew in formation. They thought as a unit. They were trained not to win individually, but to survive as a group. Each week, new American squadrons landed with updated doctrine, adapted to new enemy tactics, integrated with radars and air command systems. It was a war between an army of hastily trained youths against a standardized industrial military education system. The Japanese tragedy was accentuated by the very structure of its military culture. The rigid hierarchy made innovation difficult. Experienced pilots could not question orders. Tactical mistakes were seen as moral failures, not as learning opportunities. And combat losses did not generate adaptations, only replacements. On the aircraft carrier Zuikaku, one of the last survivors of Pearl Harbor, a mission in April 1944 ended with 3 Zeros shot down, and only 1 Hellcat damaged. The 3 Japanese pilots had less than 100 hours of flight time. One of them, Takahiro Ishida, had trained on gliders until the previous month. Before the mission, he wrote in his journal, "They said that heaven will choose the brave. I'm not brave, but I'm afraid to say that." Ishida did not return. His plane was hit at 6,000 feet by a burst shot that went through the cockpit. The Hellcat operator never saw the enemy make a single offensive maneuver. It was a straight flight, a gust, and an end. This is the most human face of the Japanese defeat. Not cowardice, but logistical, formative, and moral collapse. A system designed to create legends was now sending boys against gears of war. The difference was evident not only in the skies, but in the numbers of formation. While Japan trained 120 pilots per month in 1944, the United States was already training more than 2,500 in the same period. Each American naval aviation school, such as the one in Pensacola, was able to train more pilots in a month than all of Japan in 2 quarters. It was more than an advantage. It was an abyss. And even the veterans who still survived felt the weight of this disproportion. Many started flying with rookies as wingers, trying to protect them, but the difference in experience, technique, and instinct turned these formations into announced tragedies. On a mission over the Mariana Islands, a Japanese veteran managed to evade direct combat, but when he looked back, he saw 3 Hellcats shooting down his 2 wingmen simultaneously. They hadn't even managed to shoot. American superiority was now visible even before the fighting began. On the radio, the Americans talked clearly, adjusted positions, coordinated altitude and angle of attack. On the Japanese side, silence or confusion. On average, each Hellcat entered combat with a survival rate of 6-1. The Zeros, on the other hand, at that stage of the war, faced an inverse proportion. For everyone who returned, 2 or 3 did not return. The sky, once the domain of the samurai of the air, had been transformed into a technical, impersonal environment, cruel in its efficiency, and it was against this backdrop that a new and silent hopelessness arose among Japanese pilots, not out of fear of death, that they had accepted, but because they realized that they were no longer fighting against equals. There was no more duel. There was no more aerial honor. There was only one machine that knew where they were, how they flew, and that arrived first, shot more, resisted better, and disappeared safely. They were not being defeated by men. They were being swallowed up by a system that combined logistics, science, industry, and repetition. In the next part, the visual impact of this serialized war reaches its apex. The American aircraft carriers form a floating steel wall, and the Hellcat, until then a symbol of air supremacy, becomes just a cog in an even bigger gear. Japan no longer faced fighters. It faced large-scale production, surrounded by radars, ships, and a doctrine that did not rest. October 1944. Japan, under pressure on all fronts, was betting its last chips on a desperate maneuver, crushing the American task force that was advancing towards the Philippines. The plan was audacious and tragic. In one of the largest air offensives since the start of the war, more than 700 Japanese aircraft were launched from bases in Formosa, including Zero fighters, Betty bombers, and even some of the last G4M bombers still operational. Among the pilots were many of the last living veterans of the air elite of 1941, men who had flown over Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Guadalcanal, men who carried the doctrine, pride, and weight of a tradition that would now meet its end, not in heroic combat, but in a technological trap. Because what the Japanese commanders didn't know was that, on the other side, the U.S. Navy had become a multi-layered organism, where the sky was protected by an invisible, interconnected, and profoundly lethal system. Task Force 38, led by Vice Admiral William Halsey, was made up of 17 aircraft carriers, dozens of cruisers, destroyers, supply ships, and, above all, a sky covered by Hellcat fighters in uninterrupted shifts. The escort unit's SK and SM radar network detected enemy formations more than 200 kilometers in advance. Vector combat operators mapped altitude, speed, angle of approach. Nothing was left to chance. Before the Japanese pilots even crossed the line of attack, entire squadrons of Hellcats were already taking off, positioning themselves exactly where they were supposed to be for efficient interception. But it wasn't just that. American doctrine now operated as a program. While Japanese veterans relied on reflex and instinct, Americans applied logic, discipline, and a level of coordination unthinkable 3 years earlier. Each pair of Hellcats had a specific function: isolate, flank, finish. There was no room for improvisation. It was a choreographed execution of aerial annihilation. On the first day of the Battle of Formosa, 230 Japanese aircraft were shot down. In the second, 215 more. By the end of the third day, Japanese forces would lose 492 aircraft, including nearly all of the veteran pilots still active in the Central Pacific Theater. The magnitude of the massacre was recorded not only in the intelligence reports, but in the Hellcat's gun cameras. The images revealed Zeros being slashed in vertical dives, Betty bombers exploding before they reached the line of ships, and pilots attempting defensive maneuvers that simply no longer worked. The skies became an impossible place for any aircraft flying without radar, armor, or power superiority. And the cruelest thing, this liquidation did not happen in a single decisive battle. It took place in waves, in turns, in cycles of combat where resistance was penalized with predictability. Every Japanese attack was met with an early response. Every move calculated. It was the collapse of a generation of pilots, not out of moral inferiority, but out of systemic crushing. The Japanese government, in an attempt to preserve the morale of the population, publicized the Battle of Formosa as a great victory. Propaganda spread that dozens of American ships had been sunk, that the Empire's pilots had once again shown their unsurpassed courage. But in the hangars, in the American aircraft carriers, the gun cameras said something else. American officials watched in silence, the records of the Hellcats. Cold, calculated, emotionless sequences. A Japanese fighter appears on the display. The crosshair aligns. The burst is fired. The plane explodes or goes up in flames. Cut. The next target appears. The repetition of the method replaced any vestige of dueling or traditional combat. It was a slaughter factory. The final ratio of the Battle of Formosa was 12 Japanese aircraft shot down for every 1 American lost. And this statistic was not only a reflection of the quality of the fighters, it was the reflection of a system that had been designed to consume wars as production at scale. The greatest loss of the Battle of Formosa was not material, it was cultural. The last remnants of the Japanese ace generation were eliminated, and with them, the tactical memory, the accumulated experience, the skill transmitted orally between instructors and students disappeared. Japan had lost not only its air force, he had lost his soul in the heavens. The new generation, formed in a hurry, would fly without mentors, without consistent strategies, without a doctrinal horizon. The American squadrons knew this, and they were already preparing the next step, because what was approaching now was no longer an air battle. It was the entrance of an air machine into the heart of the empire, where not even Japanese soil would be safe. In the next part, the Hellcat takes on a new role, hunting suicide bombers in incessant waves. Japan, faced with the total destruction of its air force, would make the most desperate decision of the entire war, and the skies of the Pacific would be flooded not by combat, but by sacrifice. June 19, 1944. The sky over the Philippine Sea dawned clear, cloudless, as if the Pacific had been smoothed by an unusual silence. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in its last coordinated attempt to halt the American advance towards the Mariana Islands, fielded what was left of its embarked air force. 9 aircraft carriers, including the Zuikaku and Taiho, launched 373 aircraft at U.S. Task Force 58, an attack that, on paper, was supposed to cause a collapse on the American front. It was the final chance to alter the course of the war. But what happened that day would definitively seal the fate of Japanese aviation. The Americans were not only prepared, they had rewritten the rules. Instead of searching for the enemy in the dark, the Hellcats were guided with millimeter precision by the SK and SP radars embarked on the escort ships. Each Japanese formation was identified more than 100 miles, 160 kilometers away. In less than 15 minutes, entire squadrons of Hellcats were in the air, positioning themselves between the Japanese bombers and the American fleet. The result was a synchronized, impersonal, and methodical interception. Throughout the day, the skies turned into a slaughter field. American pilots, many of them with less than a year of combat experience, flew like cogs in a gear, in formation, aligned, operating with constant communication via radio, supported by impeccable logistical support. Each Hellcat carried 650 machine guns with tracer, incendiary, and armor-piercing ammunition, capable of dismantling any Japanese plane with 3 or 4 well-aimed shots. And that's what happened, repeatedly. In a period of just 8 hours, 346 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, most of them, even before reaching 50 kilometers from the American fleet. Many were shot down on the approach route. Some, hit in tight formations, disintegrated in midair, setting colleagues ablaze next door. Others, without cover or escort support, became isolated targets, swallowed by successive waves of Hellcats that emerged from higher altitudes, performing high-energy dives and disappearing before any reaction. The scene was so brutal, so one-way, that one of the American pilots, David McCampbell, the greatest ace in the U.S. Navy, shot down 9 Japanese planes in a single mission that day. Upon returning to the USS Essex, he reported that it was like slaughtering turkeys at a farm fair, only the turkeys didn't know they were being hunted. The expression fell like a historic sentence. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This was no longer an air war. It was a systematic execution, a ritual of the end. The samurai doctrine, with its values of courage, hand-to-hand combat, and maneuverability, collided directly with a serialized, automated, and impersonal fighting machine. The philosophy of honor met the mathematics of slaughter, and he lost. The impacts were profound. The Japanese Navy lost almost all of its embarked aircraft in a single day. Of the more than 370 planes launched, less than 50 returned to the fleets, and even these bore marks of irreparable damage. For every Hellcat lost, more than 15 Japanese planes were shot down. It was the highest rate of air supremacy ever recorded in a single engagement in the history of the war up to that time. American logistics, in turn, functioned as a continuity plant. While Japan struggled with what it could still produce and fly, the United States had already begun to replace the Hellcats in operation with new models, with better armor and more range. War was no longer about skill. It was about replacement, about who could continue operating when everything seemed worn out. And in this game, the numbers spoke loudly. In 1944, the United States produced on average a new F6F Hellcat every 66 minutes, and each of them arrived on the battlefield with interchangeable parts, pilots trained in up-to-date tactics, and full logistical support, from spare parts to high-octane fuel. For Japan, there was no turning back. June 19th sealed not only the defeat of a mission, but the total failure of a war doctrine. The veterans had been eliminated in Formosa. The new recruits, poorly trained, were decimated in the Marianas. Embarked aviation, pride of the empire since Pearl Harbor, was now a memory. And what was left? The next answer would come not from strategy, nor from technology, but of despair. Because when the pilots are gone and the fighters don't come back, there's only one weapon left: one's own body. In the next part, Japan makes a choice unprecedented in modern military history: to turn sacrifice into doctrine. And the Hellcats will now face no more planes, but human bombs. October 24th, 1944. Over the skies over Leyte Gulf, the clouds were still thick with the smell of burning fuel and suspended gunpowder. It was the second day of the largest naval battle in history, and the Japanese Navy, even torn apart, was trying to maintain its presence in the air. But on that day, American air supremacy would not be defined only by numbers, but by what happens when the war machine finds a man perfectly inserted into its system. At 07:09 in the morning, Commander David McCampbell, leader of the VF-15 squadron aboard the USS Essex, received an urgent alert. More than 60 Japanese aircraft were approaching in formation, probably for a coordinated attack against the carriers. McCampbell took off with only 6 Hellcats by his side, 7 against 60. It was the kind of mission that in any other war would border on suicide, but not in this one. Not with tactical radars, synchronized air doctrine, and the lethal efficiency of the F6F Hellcat operating as an extension of a collective mindset. The first visual contact occurred at more than 10,000 feet. McCampbell, guided by information received via shipboard radio and fleet interception operators, maneuvered his group to gain altitude superiority. The plan was simple: dive down over enemy formations, fire in short bursts, and keep the energy in continuous motion. And that's exactly what they did. McCampbell dove first, located an Aichi D-3A Val bomber group, and within 3 minutes had shot down 4. It went up in an arc, turned, went down again. 2 more Zero fighters eliminated. The sky has become a labyrinth of smoke and fire. But contrary to the chaos that traditional dogfights suggest, everything was about precision. Every maneuver, every shot, every communication, rehearsed, memorized, automated. Even American heroism was systematized. In just over 90 minutes, David McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft. No shots hit his Hellcat. None of his 6 companions were shot down. Upon returning to the USS Essex, his fighter was nearly out of ammunition, but intact. The Japanese, in turn, had lost more than half of their strength in that sector, without being able to hit a single American ship. The press would soon turn McCampbell into legend, the greatest ace in American naval aviation. But what few highlighted was the infrastructure behind this feat. McCampbell did not act alone. It was guided by radar, supported by a logistics system that delivered jet fuel every 48 hours in the middle of the war zone, operated under a combat doctrine that trained pilots for specific maneuvers against each enemy model, and flew a fighter built with structural redundancy, ballistic protection, and an engine capable of withstanding 14 punctures before losing power. His heroism was real, but it had been planned, forged, inserted in a gear where the extraordinary became replicable. This model of warfare was not just American, it was Western, it was industrial, it was the complete denial of the Japanese logic that war is won by talent, spirit, and sacrifice. Because while Japan spent its last aces on suicide offensives, the United States was training 2,000 pilots a month. And more than that, they produced the planes, the parts, the doctrine, the fuel, and the data to support them. A single Grumman plant on Long Island produced more Hellcats per month than Japan could field in a quarter. If you were surprised by this, Comment: absolute power, or logistics wins, because the story of the Hellcat is, above all, the story of a country that decided to win not only on the battlefield, but in the mathematics of war. The McCampbell episode served as the ultimate symbol of the transformation of air combat. The sky was no longer a space for duels between winged knights. It was a three-dimensional environment, dominated by sensors, radio, heavy weaponry, and doctrinal repetition. Each mission, each patrol, each interception followed protocols. Improvisation still existed, but it operated within established limits. McCampbell wasn't just a hero. It was the visible tip of a system that thought before him, saw through him, and prepared him so that, at the critical moment, his only task was to carry out the plan with precision. The American doctrine did not bet on miracles. He bet on probability. On the Japanese side, the impact was devastating. The reports that have survived reveal the bewilderment of the air commanders. Colonel Shigeharu Murata wrote in his diary, after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, "They knew where we were. They were waiting for us." Each attack seemed to fall into an invisible ambush. The Japanese Empire was beginning to understand that its war had ended months earlier. Only the blood had not yet been recognized. And even with such absolute victories in the sky, the American machine was still not satisfied, because the next stage of the war would require something even greater. It would no longer be just air superiority. It would be total domination, in the skies, in the sea, and in the heart of enemy territory. In the next part, the Hellcat will no longer face fighters. He will have a new mission: to eliminate targets that choose to die rather than retreat. Because when the sky closes, despair becomes doctrine, and hell starts to fly in a straight line. By the end of 1944, the Japanese Empire no longer recognized the skies it had dominated 3 years earlier. What had once been a field of honor and a duel between aces now seemed like an artificial, impersonal domain, where death came without warning, without a face, and with no chance of response. Internal reports from the Japanese military, declassified decades later, reveal an expression repeated by commanders and pilots: Jigoku no Yona Shinjo, a feeling of psychological hell. The phrase would become known in the archives as infernal psychosis, and she was not referring to the fear of death. It was something deeper, more corrosive, the complete absence of control. The Japanese pilots were no longer facing opponents. They faced a system, something that saw them before they saw it, who answered before they thought, who calculated his destruction in advance. This was not war, it was mechanical execution. The effect was devastating. Between November and December 1944, more than 40% of Japanese rookie pilots who participated in combat missions returned quietly, unable to report what they saw. Many have collapsed psychologically, after surviving missions in which all of their comrades had been shot down before even coming into eye contact with the enemy. The most common description in post-mission reports was, "Americans came from above, always from above, invisible until the moment of firing, then silence." The word Hellcat had ceased to stand for an airplane. It had become a symbol of something inevitable, a tactical entity. The Hellcat was no longer a machine. It was the physical manifestation of a system where each part, radar, doctrine, communication, logistics, and firepower, converged on a single point: inevitable destruction. The Japanese doctrine, built for decades on the exaltation of the warrior's spirit, personal initiative, and individual maneuver, now found its logical limit. There was no way to maneuver against a force that did not react but anticipated. There was no way to improvise against a network of pre-established decisions. The Japanese pilot, trained to win by courage, intuition, and sacrifice, now entered combat against a model that did not give room for any of this. It was like trying to fight an equation against a calculation that had already been resolved even before takeoff. The moral impact was irreversible. Lieutenant Hiroyuki Tanaka, one of the few survivors of the Marine Air Unit based on Luzon, described in 1945 what he felt when he was intercepted by Hellcats in the dark. "We flew in silence, with the instruments off, without radio transmission. Even so, they found us. They came from above, clipped our wings, and disappeared. It was as if we were being watched by eyes we couldn't see. It was not war. It was punishment." The enemy, once portrayed as unclean, noisy, dishonorable, now became a specter, a rational and invisible figure, who did not share the same combat code, American technical and systemic superiority disintegrated not only Japan's fighting strength, but its moral code. In January 1945, Admiral Somu Toyota, chief of the Navy General Staff, received reports that indicated an unprecedented phenomenon. The number of missions voluntarily aborted by young pilots had increased by 300%, not out of fear of death but out of absolute conviction that they would not reach the target. They took off knowing that they would be hunted down, intercepted, eliminated. Morale collapsed not by combat, but by the absence of it. The end was not violent. It was predictable. Japan was losing the war not only on the seas and in the air, but in the depths of its ideology, because when sacrifice does not meet resistance, it loses meaning. When the warrior attacks, and the enemy does not react as a warrior but as a net, combat ceases to exist, and with it, the soul of those who believed they were fighting for honor collapses. The Hellcat, in this context, symbolized more than the American Air Force. He symbolized the new paradigm, a world where humans still struggled, but struggled within systems much larger than themselves. Every victory was manufactured, every kill, monitored, archived, radioed to the towers, processed into tactical efficiency statistics. It was a war of data, not glory. A war where the value of an airplane was measured by its ability to repeat the same result, not by individual acts. This undermined the essence of Japanese military thinking. A country that shaped its aviation as a continuation of the samurai saber now saw its myth crumble in the face of an industry that was not thrilled. And yet, even with the visible collapse, Japan did not back down, because the next step would no longer be technical. It would be theological. When combat becomes impossible, sacrifice becomes the only possible language. And it is at this point that the concept of mission ceases to exist, and the concept of offering takes its place. In the next part, the Hellcat will face a new weapon, not faster, no longer maneuverable, but programmed to die. Because when everything breaks, the last resort is to turn one's own body into a projectile, and the skies of the Pacific would be redrawn by men who decided to fall. April 1945. The sky over Okinawa was charged with a new kind of tension, quieter, more intimate, more desperate. It was no longer a question of clashes between fighter jets. The enemy now flew in a straight line, with no intention of returning. They were pilots, yes, but they did not seek air superiority. They were looking for a collision. In the Okinawa campaign, Japan launched its last air chart, Toko attacks, popularly known as kamikazes, divine wind. Young pilots, hastily trained, boarded aircraft overloaded with explosives, with enough fuel just for the trip. The objective was unique: to hit an American ship, preferably an aircraft carrier. There was no escape plan, no chance of return. It was the sacrifice elevated to the status of doctrine. And against this new kind of threat, the Hellcats would have to operate in a new mode, not just as interceptors, but as constant guardians of what was left of logic on the battlefield. U.S. Task Force 58, anchored off Okinawa, was made up of more than 100 ships, including 14 aircraft carriers, which were priority targets for suicide attacks. Between April 6th and June 22nd, Japan launched more than 1,900 kamikaze missions against this fleet. The proportion was shocking. Instead of keeping its few remaining pilots for defensive combat, Japan chose to convert them into expendable weapons, in a last attempt to inflict unsustainable losses on the U.S. Navy. It was the logic of absolute desperation. If you couldn't defeat the enemy, at least you could make him pay a high price for victory. But this hope collided once again with American efficiency. Naval aviation no longer operated in shifts. It operated in permanent rotation. And the Hellcats weren't just on the air. They were networked. It was at this stage that the so-called lawnmower emerged, a tactic informally created by Eugene A. Valencia, a VF-9 ace with 23 confirmed victories. The idea was simple, but brutally effective. Keep patrols of Hellcats flying in linear formation parallel to the horizon, with regular spacing, forming a visual and tactical barrier over the fleet. Each squadron covered given sectors with calculated overlap of radar range and fire capacity. When a kamikaze was detected, the alert was instantaneous, and the line moved, like a blade cutting through the sky. The kamikaze was engaged 15 or 20 kilometers from the target. There was no negotiation. There was no combat. It was an exercise in anticipation. The Hellcat dived, opened fire with its 650 machine guns, and retreated. Another took over, then another. A succession, like a mill, as a system. The results were immediate. Of the 1,900 kamikazes launched, approximately 80% were intercepted before reaching their targets. Only a fraction managed to impact critical ships, and even so, the damage was contained. The American ships operated with double hulls, compartment divisions, and firefighting crews trained with protocols already tested on multiple fronts. The hell of Japanese sacrifice hit the cold wall of a system designed to absorb damage, and what was supposed to be a wave of terror ended up becoming another piece of data in the effectiveness reports. The U.S. Navy began categorizing the kamikazes as impact vector threats, studied, dissected, and neutralized with near-clinical precision. But there was also the silent tragedy. Many American pilots reported a different kind of trauma, that of having to shoot an enemy who didn't react, who didn't maneuver, who didn't defend himself. It was like aiming at a moving pole, a straight line, and yet absolutely lethal if it wasn't stopped. The air war had lost the last spark of humanity. On both sides, Japan had reduced its young men to ammunition. The U.S. intercepted them as if they were projectiles. The sky had become a machine for grinding ideologies. Even so, American efficiency prevailed. The number of Hellcats shot down in kamikaze interception missions was statistically irrelevant compared to the kills carried out. Each squadron operated with reserves. Each pilot had a rear guard. Each downed aircraft was replaced in less than 72 hours. Japan, in turn, lost something irreplaceable with each mission, a human being willing to die, and that, even the American machine could not produce. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, one of the masterminds of the attack on Pearl Harbor, would summarize this collapse in his memoirs. "We turned our children into arrows, but the enemy had built a shield that didn't just absorb, give back." The kamikaze doctrine was not just the end of a military strategy, it was the tacit acknowledgement that the war had been lost, that combat between men had been replaced by conflicting systems, and in these systems, Americans reigned supreme, with radar, radio, logistics, structure, and industrial capacity that Japan could never match. But the Hellcat was not yet done with its mission, because even with the sky clear and the enemy collapsed, the war was not won, and when the guns fall silent, the trials begin. In the next part, we'll look at how the F6F Hellcat not only changed the course of warfare, but rewrote air doctrine forever. Because when the dust settles, what is left is not the noise, it is the design that destruction has left. The real victory of the F6F Hellcat did not start in the sky. It started on the ground. Not on the runways of the Pacific, but in the industrial warehouses of Long Island, New York. There, at the headquarters of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, not just an airplane was being drawn, a system was designed, and that system was made to last, scale, and win. By 1944, Grumman was able to deliver a fully assembled Hellcat every 61 minutes. With standardized components, interchangeable modules, and production processes adjusted to the millimeter, the naval fighter was no longer a handmade piece, but a serial product of war. While the Japanese still relied on single, hand-tuned parts and engines that needed individual bench testing, the Americans had reduced aviation to a predictable and brutal assembly line. The irony of this story is that the solution was before everyone. Winning the war didn't require mysticism, it required math. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to reveal the behind the scenes of this historical engineering. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, used in the Hellcat, was the heart of this machine. An 18-cylinder, air-cooled 18-cylinder monster with more than 2,000 horsepower. Designed to operate under the harshest conditions, from the humid heat of the Philippines to the frigid altitudes of the North Pacific, it was tough, easy to maintain, and most of all, replicable. Standardization was such that a combat-damaged engine could be removed, replaced, and tested in less than 4 hours aboard an aircraft carrier. In contrast, the Nakajima Sakai 21, the engine that powered the A6M Zero, was a more delicate piece of engineering, less powerful and much more sensitive to maintenance. Its construction required almost artisanal assembly and depended on strategic materials that Japan in 1944 could no longer import regularly. The result was predictable: Every week the Hellcats multiplied, the Zeros disappeared. But American superiority wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the logic. Each Hellcat left the factory with universal technical instructions, modular maintenance systems, and a design centered on pilot and machine survival. The fuel compartments were self-sealing. The front and side armor protected the vital points. The folding wings allowed for optimized storage in naval hangars. And the controls were electrically redundant. Nothing there was luxury. Everything was function. Meanwhile, the Japanese Zeros continued to be built with the minimum possible weight, with thin structures and a light fuselage, betting on maneuverability as the main defense, a doctrinal choice that would prove fatal when the enemy began to resist, climb higher, and see first. American logistics treated war as a flow. Hellcat parts could be shipped by cargo ships, stored on aircraft carriers, and replaced in the field without the need for adaptations. The American air fleet, therefore, was not only numerous, it was resilient, able to absorb losses and restore your strength in real time. A squadron could lose 5 fighters in combat and be operational again within 48 hours. Such replacement was unthinkable in Japan, whose fighter production in 1945 had plummeted to less than 300 units per month, a number unable to sustain even the replacement of daily losses. The most impressive thing was the side effect of this industrialization: predictability. The American Naval Command knew exactly how many Hellcats could be produced, maintained, and sent to the war theater in each quarter. This allowed the creation of long-term strategies based not on hope, but on timelines. War was treated as a process, one system, where victory did not depend on punctual victories, but on the constancy of delivery. The factory became as decisive as the cockpit, and when you analyze the actual performance, the difference becomes even more brutal. During the war, the F6F Hellcat was responsible for 75% of the aerial kills carried out by American naval aviation in the Pacific. In all, more than 5,100 enemy aircraft were destroyed. Its kill-to-loss ratio was 19.3 to 1. For every Hellcat shot down in aerial combat, nearly 20 enemies fell. No other fighter in World War II delivered a similar ratio in a naval environment. This was no coincidence. It was a consequence. The final comparison, therefore, is not just between two planes. It is between two worlds. On the one hand, Japan and its belief in exceptional pilots, light machines, and the warrior spirit as a tactical advantage. On the other, the United States with a philosophy centered on mass production, mechanical robustness, and war engineering as an exact science. The result is clear. A system beats talent when talent isn't scalable. The Hellcat wasn't the best plane because it was perfect, but because it was sufficient, multipliable, and relentless. He did not win the war alone, but it symbolized the way the United States decided to fight, with numbers, with logic, and with a machine that did not stop. But there is something even more revealing in this story, because as the fighters faced off in the skies of the Pacific, another silent field was up for grabs, one that would determine not only the end of the war, but how the world would view air power from then on. In the next part, we'll reveal how the Hellcat's legacy went beyond the runways and hangars, shaping entire doctrines and paving the way for modern warfare, because an airplane can win battles, but only a well-executed idea beats time. September 1st, 1945, Atsugi Air Base, outside Tokyo. The silence that hung over the runway was not only military, it was spiritual. After years of war, after battles that had turned islands into cemeteries and seas into floating ovens, Japan was preparing to formally hand over control of its destiny. But contrary to what was expected, the first to touch the ground were not diplomats or allied generals. They were machines. More precisely, 12 F6F Hellcats of the VF-88 Squadron, descending in formation over the most sacred base of Japanese aviation. The mechanics who once served the legendary Zeros stood there, side by side with the surviving pilots, watching the enemy they had for years described as slow, heavy, clumsy. Now, it landed with mathematical smoothness, spreading its wings with hydraulic precision, silently displaying what no propaganda could hide: dominance. Robert Vasu, ace with more than 20 confirmed victories, was one of the first to leave the cockpit. Upon noticing the presence of the Japanese gathered on the edge of the runway in absolute silence, he climbed back into his aircraft and performed a sequence of maneuvers that no one there had seen before. Vertical ascent, flat turn, dive followed by recovery at low altitude, movements that would have broken any Zero in half, not only because of the fragile structure but because of the lack of power and torque. There was no ostentation there, just a demonstration. What had been ridiculed 2 years earlier now flew like a master of space. The Japanese did not applaud. They didn't even look away. What there was at that moment was respect, and more than that, understanding. Because in that landing, and in those silent acrobatics, there was not only the presence of a victorious force, there was the closing of a cycle. The same men who had laughed at the Hellcat's specs, who had despised its self-sealing tanks and armor, who had called its radios electronic cowardice, were now on the ground, with no aircraft, no ammunition, and most of all, no answers. The Hellcat was no longer a technical threat. It was a symbol that the war had changed, and that those who refused to change with her had been left behind. The most symbolic was the silence. Not a single slogan was given, not a shot, not even a broken protocol. The Hellcat, now in American naval paint still gleaming in the Japanese sun, lay with its landing gears extended like the legs of a monk in meditation. The Japanese, who had so valued the aesthetics of war, now saw beauty in what they despised. Straight lines, reinforced panels, titanium oars, no superfluous curve, just function. Commander Hiroshi Yamamoto, who had survived the Battle of the Marianas and served as a tactical instructor until the last months of the war, later recorded in his diary, "We did not lose to an airplane. We lost to an idea that we can't understand. We thought that fighting was an art. They showed that fighting can be a science." The occupation of Atsugi had no fireworks. There were no flags hoisted with fanfare. There were flights. There was a technical demonstration, and it had the crushing weight of a silent conclusion. That fighter, which Japanese pilots said looked like a tractor, had won, and now it was there, parked in the heart of the empire, like a closed book on an old samurai's desk, a book that they refused to read, and that they could no longer write. But even there, with the war over, there was still an unanswered question. How did this fighter, which was not the fastest, nor the lightest, nor the most beautiful, become the most effective air weapon in the Pacific theater? In the next part, we will reveal the final numbers, not of victories, but of production, efficiency, and predictability. Because in the end, the war belonged not to those who flew the fastest, but to those who knew where each piece should land. In 1946, a year after the official end of the war, a man quietly entered a hangar at Atsugi Air Base. His name was Jiro Horikoshi, the chief engineer responsible for the design of the A6M Zero, the plane that embodied the pinnacle of Japanese aeronautical genius at the beginning of the conflict. There, standing in front of a disassembled F6F Hellcat and arranged in sections for analysis, Horikoshi did not speak for minutes. He touched the armored coating of the cockpit. He observed the mechanisms of wing retraction. He studied the cables, conductors, control modules, and hydraulic tubes arranged with clinical precision. And finally, he murmured, "They didn't plan for today. They projected to win 5 years from now." The phrase fell like an epitaph on a generation of engineers who had sought with talent and sacrifice to fight steel with lightness, combat with aesthetics, death with honor. For Horikoshi, the war had not just been a dispute between aircraft, it was a collision of worldviews. The Zero, the ultimate symbol of Japanese aviation, was built under the logic of the sword, light, sharp, perfect in trained hands. The Hellcat, on the other hand, was the hammer, a weapon made not for dueling, but for smashing, built to operate efficiently even in the hands of average pilots, standardized to be manufactured by the thousands, and designed with redundancies and protections that would ensure that even human error did not compromise the mission. Horikoshi understood there what many generals still refused to admit. Japan had lost not because of a lack of courage, nor because of technical inferiority in the present, but because of a fundamental failure of foresight. While Japanese engineers improved maneuver performance, Americans invested in long-term robustness, cooperative combat doctrine, and integration between technology and logistics. The real victory was not in the cockpit. It was on drawing boards, in automated factories, in command centers, and in universities that trained engineers by the thousands, not dozens. Post-war studies have revealed the technical gulf between the two paradigms. The Hellcat featured 9mm front cockpit armor, 12mm rear plate, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could withstand direct hits without immediate combustion. Its fuselage was made up of field-replaceable sections, and its maintenance was reduced to standardized 60-page manuals, simple enough to be followed by trained recruits in 6 weeks. The Zero, despite its impressive initial performance, had no armor or protection for the pilot, and its structure was entirely riveted by hand, a delicate process that was difficult to repair. Horikoshi also noticed another hidden factor. American philosophy had allowed integration between forces. The Hellcats did not fly alone. They flew with the support of onboard radars, vector information, countermeasure cover, and refueling in record time. Each combat was a fragment of a system that learned, adapted, and replicated. In his memoirs, he would write, "While we sharpened the sword, they built the industrial age. Our talent was artisanal, theirs, systemic, and systems don't sleep." The recognition was not only technical, it was moral. Horikoshi never disowned the Zero. For him, it was still one of the most beautiful and elegant aircraft ever built. But he admitted, with painful serenity, that beauty does not win over lawsuits. That individual heroism, however praiseworthy, is useless in the face of a well-tuned machine. We designed for heroes. They projected for victory. In a particularly symbolic passage, the Japanese engineer reported being overcome with a mixed feeling of respect and desolation when watching images from gun cameras installed in the Hellcats. There were his planes, fragile, outdated, with inexperienced pilots, being shot down in seconds with no chance of reaction. It was like seeing an ancient ritual interrupted by an industrial siren. What he saw was not just the defeat of an airplane, but the collapse of an ideal. This testimony, coming precisely from the man who led the birth of the most iconic Japanese plane, contains more than a technical analysis. It is a confession, the realization that modern warfare no longer allows room for romantic glory when the enemy knows how to count, multiply, and repeat exactly, that it is not enough to have courage, it is necessary to have structure, and that the sky, once the domain of the knights of the air, had come to be governed by machines designed to last longer, see farther, and fight as part of a collective organism. But there is one last piece of this story, perhaps the most symbolic, because the Hellcat, despite its overwhelming role, did not survive as a cultural icon in the same way as the Zero, and it reveals something even deeper about memory, pride, and what we choose to remember. In the next part, we will explore how the Hellcat, despite being one of the most lethal fighters in history, was forgotten by the popular imagination, while the plane it defeated became legend. Because sometimes the one who wins is not the one who stays in the memory. He is the one who changes the game and then disappears. In August 2000, in the twilight of his life, Saburo Sakai, the Japanese ace who had survived 200 combat missions, dozens of aerial duels, and the loss of an eye in combat, gave one last interview. Sitting in front of a camera in respectful silence, he did not talk about victories, nor about courage. He talked about lucidity, and about the enemy who not only won, but let him live. The Hellcat didn't just beat Zero, he said. It defeated the illusion that Japan nurtured about itself. We thought we were samurai, chosen by the gods to win with honor. But we were only men with outdated weapons, facing the future. The pilot who once laughed at the F6F's crude design now recognized that this plane wasn't an aberration, it was a prophecy. The early arrival of an era in which winning was no longer a matter of bravery but of calculation. He said that on at least 2 occasions during the last months of the war, he was intercepted by Hellcats, and not shot down. They had the shot, they had the position, but they didn't pull the trigger. They chose not to kill, and that's how I survived. Not by skill, but because the enemy decided that enough was enough. These words carry no regret. They carry clarity. Sakai, who fought to the end with conviction and pride, recognized there that the adversary had overcome Japan not only with machines, but with humanity. The true power of the Hellcat was not just in its 6.50 Browning guns, nor in the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine that spewed more than 2,000 horsepower. It was in the doctrine behind the machine, a doctrine that taught its pilots not only how to win, but to know when to stop. The Americans didn't just win the war, they decided to end it. And that decision, when made inside the cockpit of a fighter with the hand resting on the trigger, is the definition of absolute power. During the interview, Sakai spoke with restrained emotion about the respect he has come to have for his enemies. He mentioned the name of David McCampbell, the greatest ace in the U.S. Navy, as someone who fought like a warrior but thought like an engineer. He recalled how the Hellcats appeared in formation, acted with impersonal coordination, and disappeared without pursuing unnecessary combat. We were looking for duels. They carried out missions. And he added, we were not inferior as men. We were outdated as ideas. This admission, made by one of Japan's most decorated pilots, contains more than a biography. It closes a historical cycle. It shows that war does not end when the enemy is slaughtered, but when he understands why he has been defeated. The F6F Hellcat isn't just a museum piece. It is a symbol of rupture, a milestone at the exact point where war ceased to be a theater of honor and became calculation, logistics, applied engineering. The Zero was designed by artisans who mastered the art of lightness. The Hellcat, by a team of engineers who dominated the weight of the world. But even in the face of all these numbers, it cannot be forgotten that the end of a war is not measured only in wreckage. It is measured in survivors. And perhaps the greatest legacy of the Hellcat was this: allowing its enemies to live long enough to tell the tale and to revere it. In the next part, the definitive conclusion. Because behind every machine, behind every statistic, there is always a bigger lesson, that in the end, war reveals more about those who choose to save than about those who pull the trigger. By the end of the war, there was no longer any doubt. The F6F Hellcat was not just a fighting machine. It was an industrial statement of supremacy. While Japan insisted on ancestral doctrines and isolated heroes, the United States integrated science, production, and military doctrine into a closed, predictable, and devastating system. Every Hellcat that took off wasn't just an airplane. It was the pinnacle of an industrial process that spanned everything from the assembly line to coordinated training, logistical support, and radar-guided tactical command. Zero, a symbol of maneuverability and honor, was overcome by a logic that did not seek duels, but repeatable victories. The laughter that once echoed in the Japanese command rooms gave way to embarrassed silence, and this silence, over time, turned into respect. What was seen as aerial rudeness turned out to be the standard of modern warfare. The Hellcat flew like an engineer and won like a system. The great lesson of this story is simple and brutal. War does not reward those who fight with more passion. It rewards those who fight with more structure. Doctrine may shape the spirit, but it is logistics that shape victory. The machine overcomes the myth. Volume beats tactics. The dice conquers dogma. Japan wasn't just defeated by tanks or fighter jets. It was defeated by processes that worked even when men failed, by factories that didn't sleep, by planes that were replaced before they were felt. When the Japanese pilot took off with ammunition counted and prayer on his lips, the American climbed up with air cover, vector planning, and spare parts waiting in Guam. The war, in the end, was won on the ground and only recorded in the sky. And if there was still any doubt as to who understood this lesson more bitterly, it is dispelled in the words of German General Alfred Jodl, pronounced before the Allied High Command when signing the surrender. We were not defeated by generals. We were defeated by trucks. If you value the search for historical truth and recognize the impact of these revelations, enjoy this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps us to continue bringing data, facts, and stories that show that war, before being combat, is calculation. Comment now. What was the most shocking data you discovered here? Ring the bell, because in the next video, you'll learn about another technical turn that changed the course of humanity. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.